3 years ago, a mother successfully manipulated the court to strip a father of his parental rights through deceit and manipulation. When the opportunity arose for the father to have his case reconsidered, she entered the courtroom with an air of unwavering confidence, convinced her deception was imperceptible. Yet, the young girl's turn to speak brought a shocking revelation that silenced the entire courtroom. Let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy these stories, remember to subscribe. On the day of the hearing, 12-year-old Julia Carter and her mother, Karen Blake, approached the formidable courthouse. The tension in the air mirrored the anxiety in Julia's stomach. Wearing stylishly oversized clothes, Julia seemed even smaller as she hurried alongside her mother. The click of Karen's high heels on the concrete broke the silence. As they neared the imposing building, its stone facade underscored the day's significance. They were greeted by Thomas Hale, their attorney, whose calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Karen's flashy appearance. "Good morning, Miss Blake, Julia," he greeted them. Karen responded tersely, eager to start. "Let's get this over with," as she ushered Julia forward. Inside, they queued for security. Thomas leaned in, reminding Karen in a low voice of their strategy to attribute Julia's condition to leukemia progression rather than neglect. Karen, growing impatient, reassured him irritably. Yes, I know. We've been over this 100 times." At the security checkpoint, a small flask was discovered in Karen's purse, leading to its confiscation. Thomas, frustrated yet silent, criticized Karen post-security for not adhering to their agreed-upon modest appearance strategy, important for making a good impression on Judge William Hardy, known for his meticulous nature in family court. Karen, defiant, insisted on presenting herself as affluent, believing it would aid their case. In the courtroom, Karen sternly reminded Julia to stay quiet and leave the talking to the adults. Meanwhile, Julia's gaze caught her father, Jonathan Carter, across the hall. His neat appearance and warm smile momentarily distracted her from her anxiety. Seizing a moment of distraction from her mother, Julia quietly made her way towards her father, her heart racing with each step. Their reunion was tender, with Jonathan complimenting her wig and expressing concern about her ongoing chemotherapy treatment. As Julia nestled into the safety of her father's embrace, she pondered how to explain her medical updates, hinting at the complexities of her situation. "I've been feeling unwell quite often these past few months, and I've missed plenty of school days," Julia murmured, her voice fading to a whisper. "Mom gets upset when I'm unable to attend school." Jonathan's expression grew concerned at her words. "And how is your mother coping?" he inquired gently. Julia glanced anxiously towards where her mother, Karen, was still engrossed in deep conversation with Thomas. "She's all right, I suppose," Julia replied slowly, "but she always seems so tired, probably from taking care of me when I'm ill." "I see," Jonathan responded, his voice even. "And are you keeping up with your medication regularly?" At this question, Julia's demeanor shifted slightly. She began shifting her weight from one foot to the other, eyes lowering to the ground. "Well, sometimes Mom forgets," she confessed quietly, "and the medicine cabinet is often locked, so I can't access my medicine when I need it." Jonathan's eyebrows rose in surprise. "The cabinet is locked? Why would that be?" Julia shrugged, her voice faint. "Sometimes Mom leaves it open, but mostly it's locked. I'm not sure why." As they conversed, Jonathan's lawyer, who had been observing from a distance, discreetly jotted down notes. Sensing Julia's unease with the topic, Jonathan decided to shift the conversation. "Hey," he said, brightening his tone, "remember the last time you visited my house? You had so much fun swimming in the pool." Julia's face brightened at the memory. "Oh, yes. Can I come swimming again soon? I really enjoy it there." Jonathan smiled, though his eyes betrayed a touch of sadness. "I hope so, sweetheart. After today, We might get to see each other more often." Julia looked confused. "Really? Why today?" She seemed unaware of the full implications of the court proceedings. Pausing, Jonathan considered how best to explain the situation. "Let me tell you a story, Julia. It's about two parent birds caring for their baby chick," he began. Julia nodded, her attention captured. "One of the parent birds was very focused on building a fancy nest," Jonathan explained. "It wanted the nest to look impressive to other birds, but it often forgot to feed the baby bird." Julia listened intently, her brow furrowing. "The other parent bird," Jonathan continued, "was more concerned about the chick's health and happiness, diligently finding the best worms and seeds." "What happened to the baby bird?" Julia asked, her voice soft. Jonathan's voice grew tender. "Well, one day an old owl, think of it as a judge for birds, visited the nest. It noticed the baby bird wasn't as healthy as it should be, and had to decide which parent bird should take care of the chick." Julia's eyes widened in realization. Is that what's happening today?" Jonathan nodded gently. "Something like that, yes. The judge, our owl, will hear both sides and determine what's best for you." Julia's expression briefly showed sadness, but then her father coaxed a small giggle from her with a playful bird impression. However, her laughter soon faded as she looked back toward her mother. "Dad," she said hesitantly, "Mom mentions that you're always busy working, and that you might not have time for me." Kneeling to meet her eye level, Jonathan's face became earnest. "Julia, listen to me. No matter what, you're my top priority. Yes, I work hard, but I promise you I will always find time for us to be together," Jonathan assured Julia, who nodded with a returning smile as they continued their hushed conversation. Unbeknownst to them, Karen had just realized Julia was not by her side. Abruptly ending her discussion with Thomas, her eyes scanned the crowded hallway frantically. "Miss Blake, where is your daughter?" Thomas exclaimed, his eyes wide with urgency. Karen spun around, her gaze sweeping through the crowd until it fixed on Julia and Jonathan, her expression darkening with a mix of anger, fear, and apparent jealousy. "Karen, wait," Thomas started, but she was already striding across the hall with determined steps, Thomas trailing behind her, attempting to keep a professional calm amidst the mounting tension. Julia, seeing her mother approaching, instinctively retreated a step from Jonathan, the comfort she felt moments ago quickly giving way to familiar anxiety. Karen reached them quickly, grabbing Julia's arm harshly and pulling her away. "Stay away from her," Karen hissed venomously at Jonathan, her voice low. "Or have you forgotten the restraining order?" "Mom, it's okay," Julia whispered faintly, trying to reassure her mother. "Dad was just being nice. We were only talking." "Be quiet," Karen snapped, silencing Julia with a stern glare. Jonathan stood firmly, his posture tense but composed as he faced Karen. He noticed a familiar scent on her breath, his suspicion evident in his slightly narrowed eyes. "Karen, have you been drinking again?" he inquired quietly, his tone more observational than accusatory. Karen recoiled as if struck, then her anger flared anew. "How dare you?" she spat. "You're fabricating lies to tarnish my reputation. I haven't touched a drop. I'm merely stating what I observed," Jonathan responded calmly. "There's no need for hostility if it isn't true." Enraged, Karen shoved Jonathan's shoulder forcefully. "You think you can just waltz back here and—" "Mom, stop!" Julia interjected, trying to mediate between her parents. However, Karen, caught up in her fury, pushed Julia aside roughly. Julia stumbled and fell to the floor. Immediately, Jonathan's lawyer, Rebecca Green, rushed to Julia's side. "Are you okay?" Rebecca asked softly, offering her hand to help Julia up. "I'm Rebecca Green, your father's attorney." Julia nodded silently, accepting Rebecca's assistance to stand, while Thomas tried to calm a still shouting Karen, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. "Stay away from my daughter," Karen yelled, losing all composure. "You've lost your rights. You shouldn't be near her." Security officers quickly intervened, creating a buffer between Jonathan and Karen. As Karen continued her tirade, reminding everyone of the restraining order, Jonathan remained composed. "Let's see about that today. See you inside, Karen," he said firmly as the officers maintained order. Rebecca led Julia back to Karen and Thomas, her expression blending concern with professional detachment. As they awaited the courtroom's opening, the atmosphere remained tense. Both parties underwent additional security checks following the commotion. Amidst the sound of metal detectors and murmurs from the security guards confirming safety, Julia's court-appointed advocate, Maria, arrived. "Stay calm," Maria whispered reassuringly to Julia, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Thank you, Maria," Julia replied, her voice steady but quiet, as she glanced apprehensively at her father and Karen, both sides now engaged in muted, intense discussions. Her fingers were anxiously picking at her nails as her mind was swirled with emotions of guilt, fear, and a faint flicker of hope. The advocate's gentle squeeze on her shoulder brought Julia back to the moment. "Whatever happens next," the woman said, locking eyes with Julia, "we'll face it together." Julia exhaled shakily. Although she wasn't sure if she believed those words, they were enough to keep her standing for now. The solemn creak of the heavy wooden doors of Judge William Hardy's courtroom announced their opening. A court officer, standing at attention, projected his voice across the tense hallway. "Carter versus Blake. All parties please enter." Moving as if through a fog, Julia followed the adults into what seemed an impossibly large courtroom, its high ceilings and dark wood paneling swallowing the morning's warmth from the tall windows. On one side of the room, Karen and Thomas positioned themselves, Karen's posture rigid, her chin defiantly lifted. Across the aisle, Jonathan and Rebecca took their seats, their demeanor both calm and determined. Julia was guided to a seat between Thomas and her court-appointed advocate, her small form nearly disappearing between them. As they waited for the judge to enter, Julia's eyes darted anxiously between her parents. Karen sat stiffly, fingers tapping an impatient rhythm on the table. Catching Julia's gaze, Jonathan offered a small, reassuring smile, which she hesitantly returned before quickly looking down. The courtroom fell silent as the bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise," the Honourable Judge William Hardy presiding. Judge Hardy entered, his observant gaze and measured steps reflecting his extensive experience in family court. As he took his seat, his gaze lingered on Julia's small figure. "Be seated," he instructed, his voice firm but gentle. "Today we are here in the matter of Carter versus Blake, a petition to modify custody arrangements for the minor child, Julia Carter. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that our purpose is to determine what is in the best interest of the child. I expect all parties to conduct themselves accordingly." After a pause to let his words sink in, he addressed the lawyers. "Counsellors, are you prepared to proceed?" Both Thomas and Rebecca confirmed their readiness. "Very well," Judge Hardy nodded. "For the record, let's establish some context. Mr. Jonathan Carter and Miss Karen Blake were divorced 3 years ago, with Miss Blake awarded full custody of their daughter, Julia. Mr. Carter's visitation rights were severely restricted following allegations of abuse and emotional instability. Is this correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Rebecca confirmed. "And now, Mr. Carter is petitioning the court to reopen the custody case and revoke Ms. Blake's parental rights based on new evidence." "That's correct, Your Honor," Rebecca stated firmly. "We have uncovered substantial evidence of neglect regarding Julia's cancer treatment and misuse of child support funds. Additionally, Mr. Carter's observations during limited supervised visits have revealed signs of neglect, including frequent unexplained illnesses and injuries. Judge Hardy nodded, his expression neutral. "I see. And Miss Blake denies these allegations?" "Absolutely, Your Honor," Thomas interjected. "We maintain that Julia's health issues are due to her ongoing battle with leukemia, not neglect." "Very well," Judge Hardy said. "We will hear all the evidence in due course. Let's begin with opening statements. Miss Green, as the petitioner, you may proceed." Rebecca stood confidently, addressing the court. "Your Honor, this case is about more than custody. It's about the safety, well-being, and future of a child who has been neglected and emotionally harmed by her custodial parent. We will prove that Miss Karen Blake has deliberately misused child support funds intended for Julia's care, engaged in abusive behavior, and manipulated previous court proceedings to unjustly strip Mr. Jonathan Carter of his parental rights. Today, we seek to rectify this grave injustice and ensure Julia's future is placed in safe hands." As Rebecca spoke, Julia's eyes widened, her gaze shifting between her mother's increasingly tense posture and her father's steady presence. Judge Hardy then turned to Thomas. "Mr. Hale, your opening statement." Thomas rose, straightening his tie. "Your Honor, Miss Karen Blake has always acted in Julia's best interest. Mr. Carter's accusations are baseless and an attempt to regain control over a family dynamic that has already been resolved in this court. We will demonstrate that Julia's health challenges are a result of her ongoing battle with leukemia, not neglect. Miss Blake has been a devoted mother, navigating the challenges of single parenthood while caring for a seriously ill child. Mr. Carter's petition is nothing more than an attempt to use his financial advantage to malign Miss Blake and disrupt the stability Julia has under her mother's care." As Thomas spoke, Karen nodded emphatically, while Jonathan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Caught between them, Julia seemed to shrink further into her seat. Judge Hardy's expression remained impassive as he absorbed both perspectives, though his eyes occasionally drifted to Julia's small figure at the table. "Thank you, counsellors," he said as Thomas concluded. "We'll now proceed with the presentation of evidence. Miss Green, you may call your first witness." The tension in the courtroom intensified as Rebecca stood once more, ready to present their case. Julia's hands twisted nervously in her lap, her young mind grappling with the gravity of the proceedings that would determine her future. She often quickly retracted her words, seemingly fearful of the potential repercussions of speaking out. Throughout the testimony, Julia remained silent, her gaze downcast, yet with each revelation she seemed to withdraw further into herself, as if attempting to disappear under the weight of the truths being aired. As the morning progressed and the evidence against Karen mounted, the courtroom's atmosphere tightened. Julia, caught in the center of this storm of adult conflicts, appeared increasingly small and vulnerable, the weight of the proceedings bearing down on her young shoulders. As Karen's story showed more inconsistencies, her agitation became clearly visible. Her leg twitched nervously under the table, and her eyes flitted around the courtroom, like a cornered animal seeking an escape route. Eventually, overwhelmed, Karen abruptly stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is ridiculous," she exclaimed, her face flushed with anger. "You're all conspiring against me. Jonathan and his fancy lawyer have been stalking me and fabricating lies." The courtroom descended into chaos. Thomas attempted to calm Karen, while Jonathan half rose from his seat, only to be held back by Rebecca's steady hand on his arm. Judge Hardy's gavel struck with a resounding crack. "Order," he demanded, his voice slicing through the noise. "This court will take a 20-minute recess. Counsel, ensure your clients are prepared to continue in an orderly manner when we reconvene." As the judge left the bench, Karen stormed out of the courtroom, and Julia followed her out for a breath of fresh air. Outside, Karen, with trembling hands, lit a cigarette and turned to Julia. "Wait here, don't follow me," she commanded, then strode away, leaving her daughter alone and confused. Jonathan stepped out and noticed Julia sitting alone on the corridor floor, her small frame seeming even smaller in the expansive hallway. After a moment's hesitation, he approached her, mindful of the restraining order but compelled by the sight of his daughter so isolated. He knelt beside her, their eyes meeting in a moment of shared understanding. "I'm sorry I haven't been there," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "but no matter what happens today, I'll make it right." Julia's eyes filled with tears. "It's hard," she whispered back, "but I'm trying to be strong." Jonathan's heart ached at her words. He longed to embrace her and shield her from the harsh realities of the courtroom. Instead, he kept his voice low and soothing. "You're doing so well, sweetheart. I know this is hard, but you're so brave. I think Mom is angry," he observed thoughtfully. Julia looked up at Jonathan. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Julia, if anything is wrong, if your mother has hurt you in any way, you can tell me. You can count on me. I will do everything in my power to ensure you're safe and happy." Julia's eyes glistened with unshed tears. She opened her mouth as if to speak, her hand moving toward her wig as if she might remove it, but before she could say anything, Karen returned, the smell of cigarette smoke and alcohol clinging to her clothes. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Karen snarled as she stormed toward them. "I left for 5 minutes, and you can't keep your hand off my daughter." She looked around and called to a security officer standing by inside the courtroom. "Security! He's violating the restraining order." Jonathan stood quickly, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Karen, please. I was just checking on our daughter." "She's not your daughter anymore," Karen spat, her fury unabated. "You lost that right." As security officers approached, Jonathan pointed out the fresh smell of alcohol on Karen's breath. "Have you been drinking during the recess?" he asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and anger. Karen's face twisted with rage. "How dare you? You're just trying to make me look bad." The argument escalated quickly, with Julia caught in the middle, her eyes wide with fear. Court security officers intervened, physically separating Jonathan and Karen. Amidst the chaos, Karen grabbed Julia's arm and dragged her toward the women's restroom. Once inside the empty space, Karen's facade crumbled. "How dare you talk to him?" Karen hissed, tears in her eyes. "After everything I've done for you." Julia, through her tears, found her voice. "I miss him, Mom. Why can't we be a family again?" Karen's eyes flashed dangerously. "You ungrateful child. Your father is only acting nice now. Once you live with him, he'll show his true colors. He's a businessman, always working. He won't have time for a stupid, ugly child like you." Julia, pushed beyond her breaking point, spoke up. "Even if Dad's always working, it would be better than being hit and mocked every day." She met her mother's eyes firmly. "Dad was right. You were drinking again. I can smell it too." The words had barely left her mouth when Karen's hand connected with her cheek, leaving an angry red mark. "Listen to me. What you said to your advocate is bad enough already. If you do anything funny in that courtroom," Karen threatened, her voice low and dangerous, "I'll make sure you never see either of us again. Now wash your face and cover those red marks with powder. Then fix that sad look. We're going back in." As Julia obediently washed her face, her mother's threat echoing in her ears, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. The girl staring back at her looked lost and afraid, a far cry from the happy child she once was. With trembling hands, she applied the face powder her mother handed her, doing her best to hide the red mark on her cheek. Outside the restroom, the corridor buzzed with tension as everyone prepared to re-enter the courtroom. Julia's steps were heavy as she followed her mother, the weight of secrets and fears pressing down on her small shoulders. Back in the courtroom, Julia's eyes met her father's across the room. He had returned to his seat. When Julia almost reached a table, she saw him discreetly sign, "I love you, my girl," in their special sign language, a faint smile touching Julia's lips as she remembered the nights he had spent teaching her to communicate with her deaf best friend at school. It was a small gesture, but it brought a moment of comfort amid the turmoil. It brought a small flicker of warmth to her heart. Judge Hardy returned to the bench, his measured gaze sweeping over the courtroom before resting on Julia. His expression softened as he addressed her directly. "Julia," he said, his voice firm yet kind, "I'd like to hear from you now. I know this might feel scary, but this courtroom is a safe place for you to share your truth. Can you tell us about your life at home?" Julia hesitated, her eyes darting nervously between her mother's stern glare and her father's encouraging nod. The dull throb on her cheek where her mother had struck her earlier lingered beneath the layer of makeup. Her mother's threats from the restroom echoed in her mind, clashing with her father's gentle promises of safety. "It's okay, Julia," Judge Hardy reassured her, his tone gentle but steady. "Take your time. And if anyone has threatened you or tried to keep you from telling the truth, you can let me know about that, too." Her gaze dropped to her lap, her small hands twisting nervously. Julia thought about her mother's sharp words, warning that her father would neglect her too, that he wouldn't have time for her. But then she remembered the warmth in his eyes, the gentle way he used to hold her hand, and the time he always made for her before the divorce. Looking up, she met her father's gaze. He gave her a soft smile, a barely perceptible nod, silently urging her on. With trembling hands, Julia reached up and removed her wig. The courtroom grew still, the silence thick and heavy as her bald head was revealed, marked by bruises and partially healed wounds. A chorus of audible gasps rippled through the room. Jonathan half rose from his seat, a strangled sound escaping him, but Rebecca's firm hand on his arm kept him from rushing to his daughter. Through her tears, Julia began to speak, her voice quiet but growing stronger. "Mom drinks a lot," she said, her eyes fixed on Judge Hardy. "When she drinks, she gets mad. And she hits me, sometimes with her hands, other times with things like shoes or the TV remote." Karen abruptly stood, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "She's lying," she shouted, her face flushed with anger. "Those marks are from a fight at school." Judge Hardy's gavel struck sharply. "Miss Blake, sit down immediately," he commanded. "Julia, please continue." Julia nodded, her voice a little steadier now. "Mom forgets my medicine a lot. The cabinet is usually locked, and I can't get to it when I need it. She doesn't take me to therapy anymore, and the house is really messy. I get sick all the time after my chemo because she doesn't help me with my wounds, and they get infected sometimes." Her lower lip trembled as she continued, "She calls me ugly, because of how I look after chemo. She says the wig is the only thing that keeps me from being embarrassing to be seen with." The room was deathly silent, her words hanging in the air like a heavy weight. Jonathan's face was etched with anguish, while Karen sat rigid, her expression flickering between fury and fear. Julia's voice softened to a whisper. "Your Honor, I'm scared to go home with my mom. She hurts me and doesn't take care of me when I'm sick. She even hit me in the restroom earlier during recess. Please, arrest her. I want to live with my dad." The courtroom erupted into murmurs and whispers, the tension breaking into a flurry of noise. Judge Hardy's gavel struck again, commanding silence. "Order," he demanded. "Thank you for your bravery, Julia," he said, his voice steady yet warm. "You've done the right thing by telling us the truth." Julia nodded, tears streaming down her face as she carefully placed her wig back on. She avoided her mother's gaze, instead seeking out her father's across the room. The raw love and pain in his eyes gave her a small measure of solace amidst the storm of emotions. Rebecca Green stood next, maintaining a professional composure despite the emotional weight of the moment. "Your Honor," she began, in light of Julia's statement, "I'd like to present additional medical documentation that corroborates her account." Judge Hardy nodded. "Proceed, Miss Green." Rebecca approached the bench with a thick folder. "These are Julia's complete medical records, including notes from her oncologist, general practitioner, and the school nurse. They show a clear pattern of missed appointments and untreated infections." As Rebecca spoke, a series of images appeared on the courtroom screen. X-rays and photographs documented injuries consistent with Julia's testimony. Notes from the school nurse detailed unexplained bruises and cuts, as well as frequent illnesses and absences. "As you can see, Your Honor," Rebecca continued, "these injuries and illnesses go far beyond what could be expected from Julia's leukemia treatments. They paint a clear picture of neglect and abuse." Karen's face drained of color as the damning evidence played out on the screen. Her eyes darted nervously between the images and her daughter's small figure at the table. Thomas leaned in, whispering urgently in her ear, but his words did little to mask the panic spreading across her face. Rebecca's voice remained steady as she addressed the court. "Your Honor," she began, "we would now like to present evidence of Ms. Blake's deliberate manipulation during the prior custody hearing. Our investigation has revealed falsified documents that were submitted to depict Mr. Carter as an unfit parent." She displayed a series of documents on the courtroom screen, pointing to fabricated claims of abuse and altered medical records. "Additionally," Rebecca continued, "we have a witness who will testify about being coerced into signing a false affidavit against Mr. Carter." At this revelation, Karen's fragile composure shattered. She shot to her feet, the loud scrape of her chair echoing in the courtroom. "This is all lies," she screamed, her voice shrill with panic. "You can't believe any of this." Judge Hardy brought his gavel down sharply. "Miss Blake, control yourself, or you will be held in contempt. Mr. Hale, ensure your client remains composed." Thomas leaned in, attempting to calm Karen as Rebecca called her next witness. A nervous man in his early 40s took the stand, introducing himself as Michael Dawson, a former acquaintance of Karen. "Mr. Dawson," Rebecca began, "can you tell the court about the affidavit you signed 3 years ago regarding Mr. Carter's behavior?" Michael swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously to Karen before focusing on Rebecca. "3 years ago, I signed an affidavit claiming I witnessed Mr. Carter acting aggressively towards Julia and Ms. Blake. But that wasn't true." Gasps rippled through the courtroom as Judge Hardy banged his gavel for silence. "Continue, Mr. Dawson." "Ms. Blake approached me," Michael explained. "She said she needed my help to protect Julia from her father. She told me what to write in the affidavit and threatened to reveal some personal information about me if I didn't comply. I'm ashamed to say I gave in." As he spoke, Karen's face twisted with rage. She lunged forward, pointing a finger at him. "You lying bastard," she screamed. "We had a deal." Judge Hardy's voice boomed. "Miss Blake, one more outburst, and you will be removed from this courtroom. Mr. Hale, control your client immediately." Karen slumped back into her chair, trembling with suppressed fury. Meanwhile, Julia, sitting quietly in her seat, seemed to shrink further, her wide eyes betraying her fear. Rebecca called the private investigator to the stand next. He presented a detailed report with photographic and video evidence. "Our surveillance revealed a consistent pattern of neglect," he stated. "Security camera footage showed Julia left alone for extended periods, sometimes late into the night. Additional evidence documented Karen's frequent visits to bars and liquor stores, often coinciding with Julia's scheduled medical appointments. Financial records were presented next, showing unauthorized withdrawals from Julia's medical fund. These withdrawals were traced to personal expenses, including luxury items and non-essential purchases. Furthermore, the investigator added, "We have statements from neighbors who reported hearing frequent disturbances, including shouting and the sound of a child crying, from Ms. Blake's residence." Karen's defiant demeanor gave way to visible agitation. She interrupted repeatedly, her outbursts damaging her credibility further. Thomas attempted to argue that Julia's wounds were side effects of chemotherapy, but the mounting medical evidence and Julia's testimony rendered his claims hollow. The final witness, a child psychologist specializing in abuse cases, described the psychological impact on Julia. "Julia exhibits classic signs of long-term emotional and physical abuse," the psychologist explained. "Her reluctance to speak out, her inclination to protect her abuser, and her physical symptoms all point to a deeply traumatic home environment. The combination of neglect and violence has created an atmosphere of extreme stress, which severely hampers her ability to recover from her cancer." Julia remained silent throughout the testimonies, her head bowed. Occasionally, she glanced at her father, drawing strength from his steady and supportive presence. By the end of the morning, the evidence against Karen was overwhelming, and the courtroom was heavy with the grim realization of the extent of Julia's suffering and the miscarriage of justice in the previous hearing. As the final witness stepped down, Judge Hardy called a brief recess before closing arguments. Julia was escorted out by her court-appointed advocate, her small figure flanked protectively. When court reconvened, Rebecca rose for her closing argument. Her voice was calm but carried a weight of conviction. "Your Honor," she began, "over the course of these proceedings, we have presented irrefutable evidence of Ms. Blake's systematic abuse and neglect. The financial records clearly show the misuse of child support funds meant for Julia's care. The medical evidence and expert testimony have painted a disturbing picture of physical abuse and negligence." Rebecca paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "We've heard from Julia herself, bravely sharing her experiences of fear, pain, and neglect. We've seen proof of Ms. Blake's manipulation during the previous custody hearing, where she unjustly stripped Mr. Carter of his parental rights based on fabricated accusations." She gestured toward Jonathan. "Mr. Carter has demonstrated his unwavering commitment to Julia's well-being. He initiated this investigation out of genuine concern for his daughter's safety, and has shown he can provide the stable, loving home environment that Julia so desperately needs, especially as she battles leukemia." Rebecca's voice grew impassioned as she concluded, "Your Honor, it is clear that Julia's current living situation is not only unsuitable but actively dangerous to her physical and emotional health. We respectfully ask the court to grant full custody to Mr. Carter immediately to ensure Julia's safety and give her the best chance at recovery, both from her illness and the trauma she has endured." Rebecca took her seat, her expression composed. When Thomas rose for his closing statement, his earlier confidence was visibly shaken. "Your Honor," he began, his voice strained, "while the evidence presented today is concerning, we must remember the extraordinary challenges of raising a child with a serious illness like leukemia. Ms. Blake has been Julia's primary caregiver throughout this time, managing her medical care while also handling the burdens of single parenthood." He paused, searching for the right words. "We acknowledge that there have been lapses in judgment." Thomas urged the court to consider the immense stress Karen had been under, proposing mandated counseling and support services as an alternative to a drastic custody change, which he argued would cause yet another upheaval in Julia's life. But as he spoke, Karen's agitation became more pronounced. She shifted in her seat, her eyes darting nervously around the room. When Thomas finished, Karen suddenly bolted upright. "This is all lies," she shouted, her voice high-pitched and trembling. "Julia is mine. Jonathan can't have her." Judge Hardy's gavel struck the bench sharply. "Miss Blake, sit down immediately, or you will be removed from this courtroom." Karen sank back into her chair, her body trembling with barely suppressed fury. Julia, watching from her seat, seemed to shrink further into herself, her wide eyes betraying her fear. Judge Hardy's expression was somber as he addressed the courtroom. In light of the extensive evidence presented today, I will take a short recess to consider my verdict. We will reconvene in 30 minutes. As the judge exited the bench, a tense murmur spread through the courtroom. Jonathan leaned in to quietly confer with Rebecca, while Karen angrily whispered to Thomas. Meanwhile, Julia sat quietly with her advocate, clutching her wig and sneaking glances at her father, her anxiety evident. The 30-minute recess stretched into what felt like an eternity for everyone involved. When Judge Hardy finally returned, the room fell silent, all eyes fixed on him as he prepared to deliver his verdict. After careful consideration of all the evidence presented, I am ready to deliver my verdict, he announced, his voice authoritative and steady. This case has revealed a deeply troubling situation that requires immediate action to ensure the safety and well-being of the child involved. The judge's gaze swept the courtroom before he continued. First, I must address the evidence of Ms. Blake's persistent abuse and neglect. The financial records clearly establish a pattern of misusing funds intended for Julia's care. Furthermore, the medical evidence and Julia's own testimony illustrate a harrowing picture of physical abuse and medical neglect, both of which have jeopardized Julia's health and well-being. Karen's face drained of color as the judge spoke, while Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his expression caught between hope and concern. Additionally, Judge Hardy continued, the evidence of manipulation in the prior custody hearing is gravely serious. The false testimony and altered documents presented 3 years ago led to an egregious miscarriage of justice, unfairly stripping Mr. Carter of his parental rights. The judge's tone sharpened as he addressed Karen directly. Ms. Blake, your actions have not only endangered your daughter's physical health, but have inflicted profound emotional harm. Your conduct in this courtroom today has only reinforced the doubts about your ability to provide a stable and nurturing environment for Julia. Karen seemed to wither under the judge's stern words, her earlier defiance dissolving into despair. Judge Hardy then turned his attention to Jonathan. Mr. Carter, while you were unjustly deprived of your parental rights, you have demonstrated a steadfast commitment to Julia's well-being by pursuing this investigation and taking steps to address the situation. With a deep breath, Judge Hardy delivered his decision. In light of all the evidence, I hereby order the immediate transfer of full custody of Julia Carter to her father, Jonathan Carter. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Julia's eyes widened, darting back and forth between her parents as she processed the ruling. The judge continued, Ms. Blake, you are hereby ordered to undergo a comprehensive psychological evaluation and to enroll in an alcohol rehabilitation program. Until these programs are completed and reviewed, your visitation rights will be limited to supervised visits only. Karen let out a strangled cry, but Judge Hardy maintained his composure. Furthermore, I am appointing a guardian ad litem to oversee Julia's transition and ensure her ongoing care and safety. This guardian will work closely with Mr. Carter and Julia's medical team to address all her needs. Finally, the judge's voice softened slightly as he addressed Julia directly. Julia, I know this process has been incredibly difficult and frightening for you. Your courage in speaking out has been extraordinary, and my hope is that this decision will help you find the stability and support you need to heal and move forward. The judge concluded his ruling with a soft yet resolute tone. Julia, your bravery in speaking up today has ensured your safety and well-being moving forward. His words marked the end of a turbulent chapter, but also the beginning of a new one. As the gavel fell, the courtroom erupted into a flurry of movement. Court officers moved swiftly to take Karen into custody on charges of child abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation. She struggled, making one last desperate attempt to reach Julia. You can't do this. Karen screamed, her voice cracking with emotion. "She's my daughter." Julia's advocate quickly stepped in, shielding her from Karen's outburst. Jonathan, tears streaming down his face, approached Julia cautiously. He knelt to meet her at eye level, his voice soft yet firm. "It's over, sweetheart," he whispered. "You're safe now." For a moment, Julia hesitated, then rushed into her father's arms. They clung to each other, both crying quietly as the courtroom slowly emptied around them. It was a moment of profound relief, the start of their long journey to heal. As the initial shock of the verdict subsided, the room buzzed with activity. Jonathan, still holding Julia close, made his way around the courtroom, thanking those who had helped uncover the truth and secure justice for his daughter. He approached Rebecca first, shaking her hand warmly. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "Your investigation and unwavering support made all the difference." Rebecca's professional demeanor softened into a warm smile. "It was an honor to help, Mr. Carter. But Julia's bravery made it all possible." Jonathan moved on to express his gratitude to the private investigator, the school officials, and the medical professionals who had testified. Each received his heartfelt thanks for their courage and dedication. The child psychologist who had spoken about Julia's trauma approached, handing him a business card. "Julia will need ongoing support to process everything she's been through," she explained gently. "Please don't hesitate to reach out if you need guidance or resources." Jonathan nodded, carefully tucking the card into his pocket. Throughout the interactions, his protective arm remained around Julia, who stayed close by, her wide eyes quietly observing the bustling room. Meanwhile, Rebecca worked to organize the necessary paperwork. She handed Jonathan a thick folder and explained its contents. "Here's everything you'll need for the immediate future," she said. "New custody agreements, medical transfer authorizations, school documentation, and a copy of the restraining order against Karen. I've also included contact information for the guardian ad litem assigned to Julia's case." As Jonathan reviewed the documents, the court-appointed guardian approached. She was a calm, kind-faced woman in her 50s who immediately put Julia at ease. "Mr. Carter, Julia," she greeted warmly. "I'm Marilyn Lawson, the guardian ad litem assigned to your case. May we discuss the next steps?" Jonathan nodded, guiding Julia to a nearby bench. Marilyn outlined the immediate priorities, scheduling a comprehensive medical evaluation to assess Julia's condition and adjusting her treatment plan. "Therapy sessions should also begin as soon as possible," Marilyn added, her tone gentle but firm. "Julia will need support to process everything she's been through." Jonathan listened intently, his hand gripping Julia's tightly. "Of course," he agreed. "Her health and well-being are my top priorities. I'll make sure she gets the care and support she needs." Marilyn smiled approvingly. "That's excellent to hear, Mr. Carter. I'll check in regularly to ensure everything is going smoothly and provide additional support as needed." As the discussion continued, the courtroom slowly emptied. The last to leave was Karen, escorted out by officers. She cast one final bitter glance at Jonathan and Julia. Julia instinctively pressed closer to her father, who tightened his protective embrace around her. With the legal proceedings concluded, Jonathan and Julia prepared to leave the courthouse. The day had been long and emotionally draining, but as they gathered their belongings, a palpable sense of relief and hope hung in the air. Stepping out into the sunlight, Jonathan and Julia walked through the courthouse corridors, their pace slow from physical and emotional exhaustion. As they approached the exit, Jonathan knelt to meet Julia's eyes. "Are you ready to go home, sweetheart?" he asked gently. Julia nodded, a small smile breaking through her exhaustion. "Yes, Dad," she said softly. As they drove home, Jonathan turned to Julia, his voice thick with emotion. "I want you to know," he began, "you'll never have to go through anything like that again. I promise to keep you safe and happy." Julia's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded and reached for his hand. "I know, Dad," she whispered. During the drive, Jonathan discussed her ongoing treatment and therapy. "We're going to get you the best care possible," he assured her. "Doctor's appointments, therapy sessions. We'll handle it all together, okay?" Julia nodded but hesitated before speaking. "Dad," she said quietly, "Mom said. She said you'd be too busy for me, that you wouldn't have time." Jonathan's heart ached at her words. He took a deep breath. "Julia," he began, "I do have a lot of responsibilities at work, but you are my top priority. I'll adjust my schedule, delegate tasks, whatever it takes to be there for you. We've lost so much time, and I promise to make up for it." Julia considered his words, then nodded. "Okay, Dad," she said, her voice steadier. "I believe you." When they arrived at the house, now their house, Jonathan asked, "What do you want to do first?" Julia's face lit up as she spotted the swimming pool. "Can we swim?" she asked excitedly. Jonathan laughed, a warm, genuine sound. "Of course," he said. As they splashed in the pool together, laughter echoed across the backyard. For the first time in years, both father and daughter felt a sense of hope and peace. The journey ahead would be challenging, but they knew they would face it together, ready to create new memories and rebuild their lives.